Okay, let's think, brain. Turn to page 1171 in your textbook, please. So today we're starting what is going to amount to several weeks, covering two plays by Shakespeare, Midsummer Night's Dream and Hamlet. Most of today will probably be taken up with this kind of background information. Write down one more thing. Actually, skip 1171 and go to 1173, where we get, I'm not going to use this edition again. I'm going to make the bookstore go back to the 10th edition because this introduction is too brief compared to what's in the 10th edition, if I remember correctly. You've got a couple of portraits there on 1172. The first one, the one at the top left, is from the first folio, this what I've written down up here, and I meant to bring in a copy. I've got a facsimile copy of the first folio. Called the Chandos, Chandos is the one on the right. The one above, trying to remember what it's called. It's not just called the first folio. There's another name for it. I think it's the Droeshout painting. Okay, so you've got that one, and then you've got the Chandos portrait on the right. And if this were my Shakespeare course, I would have on the front page of the syllabus two different portraits of Shakespeare, not including the one from the first folio. There's the Chandos, and then there's another one that is thought to be of Shakespeare at about 22, 24 years of age. This is only discovered, if I remember correctly, in like the last 50 or 100 years. Okay? One of the interesting things about Shakespeare is, even though he is almost universally accepted as the greatest writer in the English language and the greatest dramatist who has ever lived, and that includes Sophocles and all the Greek dramatists and all the Roman dramatists, that Shakespeare was the best at that art than anybody else. We know almost nothing about him personally. That is, we know almost nothing about his history. We don't even know the exact date of his birth. You'll often see it in your book mentions about, on or about, April 23rd, 1564. We say on or about because we have his baptismal certificate. And baptisms at that time were done within a few days after birth. Okay? He's raised Catholic. All right? So, kind of choose April 23rd. Why? I think there's a reason for that, and that has to do with his death. He died April 23rd, 1660. They know he was born within like 2 or 3 days, plus or minus April 23rd. So there's a nice parallel, a nice balance there by going with that date. That date also, April 23rd, is also in the church's calendar, St. George's Day. St. George is the patron saint of England. So again, there's a nice kind of balance there because you have the greatest writer in the English language. Why did that come on all of a sudden? Go off. The greatest writer in the English language being possibly born on the day that is dedicated to the patron saint of all of England. Okay? So he's born in 1564, probably April 23rd. His parents are Catholic. The country at that time isn't Catholic. I mean, there are Catholics, but the government is not Catholic. The government is not quite, it's not yet anti-Catholic. It's kind of a, Bill Clinton's policy regarding gays in the military. Don't ask, don't tell. Don't ask somebody what their religion is. And if you're Catholic, don't tell anybody what your religion is, and we'll just let everybody get along, quietly. Right? A few years will go by, and not many, 4, and that will start to become, Catholicism will become harder and harder to, for one to identify as. Okay? Eventually, Catholicism gets outlawed to where if you are a Catholic and you acknowledge me, let me back up. If you're a Catholic priest, that's a capital offense. Just being a priest in England is cause for death. And there were many Catholic priests who were executed, many Catholic priests who were hunted down and such. Okay? With Shakespeare, there's a ton of books, okay? A ton of books and articles written about Shakespeare's religious beliefs. Shakespeare kind of straddles the line. There are elements that emphasize kind of a Protestant ideology, and there are elements that kind of emphasize a Catholic ideology. We're going to see, for example, in Hamlet, you've got both of those. There are some things in Hamlet that could only be said by a Catholic. And there are some other things that, emphasize, if not a Protestant belief system, at least an appreciation for, an awareness and appreciation for Protestantism. We'll talk about that when we get there. Okay? So, in 1582, he marries Anne Hathaway. So, notice, Shakespeare's 18. She's 26. To be a 26-year-old unmarried woman in Elizabethan England, that's, to use the old phrase, old spinster. She was beyond her time, so to speak. Okay? About 6 months later, they have their first child. So there's pretty good reason why they got married. Right? First child is daughter Susanna. She's born in February of 1583. They are not married in Stratford, where Shakespeare is from and where Anne Hathaway is from. They get married in another shire or another county. Okay? In Shakespeare's day, when you got married, and this continued well up, I think, into the 1800s, part of the tradition in the church and civil society was that the church, the local priest, the local rector, had to announce what are called the banns. B-A-N-N-S. And that had to happen, I think it is, I always get this confused. It's either 3 consecutive Sundays before the wedding or 1 Sunday a month for 3 months before the wedding. Okay? And the banns are William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway are to be wed. If anyone knows any reason why they shouldn't be wed, let him speak now or forever hold his peace. That language that in some religious traditions gets put into the actual wedding ceremony, right? That wasn't read. We know that for Shakespeare's wedding. And it's because Anne was pregnant. Okay? By the way, when that happened in a English wedding, if somebody 2 weeks before said, yeah, I know why they shouldn't get married, he took the virginity of my daughter, that was cause. Or, she's not a virgin anymore. That was cause for a wedding to be broken off. Okay? In Shakespeare's day. So, 1583, eldest child, Susanna, is born. Okay? About a year and a half later, this is February, this is, I don't remember the exact month. I think it's about a year and a half later. It's not 2 years. Take that back. It is like January or something. The twins, Hamnet and Judith, are born. Hamnet, not Hamlet. Okay? But Hamnet does die early. 1598, 99, right around there. Okay? And then from 1585 to 1592 are called the lost years. So notice that. By 1585, when Shakespeare's 21 years old, he's got 3 kids and a wife. She stays at home, so he's got to provide for them. From 1585 to 1592, we have what are called the lost years. And that's because we have no idea what Shakespeare was doing. Let me rephrase that. We have no firm idea. There are speculations, there are rumors, there are stories. There's no proof or evidence for any of it. One of the stories, ideas, is that Shakespeare was traveling the continent, Europe, possibly as an actor, okay? And it was while traveling the continent that he picked up some foreign languages. We know, for example, Shakespeare had to know French. Had to. Pretty clear he knew Italian. He had to know French because one of the sources of the first play we're going to read, Midsummer Night's Dream, was only available in French. It had not been translated into English. Okay? He knew Latin. He knew some Greek. And that's because of the elementary school education he had. In Shakespeare's day, kids started going to school if they went to the local, what we call public school. There it's considered kind of a private school. They would start around somewhere between 5 to 7 years old, and they would be in that grammar school for about 6 years. So 11 to 12, 13 years, okay? And most of that would be conducted initially in Latin. So where you're learning Latin at the age of 5, 6, or 7. And you start learning Greek about 3 or 4 years later, okay? And it got to the point where when a child would leave grammar school, he or she, because girls did go, not many, but some did, he or she would know probably more Latin than a college classics major, somebody who majors in Latin and Greek. They would know that by the age of 12 or 13. Okay? It was so drilled into them. Here's an example of one of the lessons a student would have. The student, in the Latin phase, would be given a text, something like a passage from Caesar's Gallic Wars. Caesar writes fairly simple Latin. Okay? They'd receive that in the Latin, and they'd have to pull out their slate and translate that Latin into English. Okay? And the master would look at it, go over it. If there were egregious errors, the child would probably get the knuckles wrapped with like a yardstick, right? That's not the hard part. The hard part then would be taking the Latin original away, so the student only has the translation that he or she has provided on the slate, and then they would have to translate that back into Latin. And it had to match the original text. And if it didn't, you'd be penalized. Real penalized, not, oh, you're stupid. I mean, pain would be involved, okay? Kind of, really motivate you to learn well, right? So he knew Latin and Greek. Some of his sources were in Latin and Greek, etc., right? So 1585 to 1592, he's doing what we don't know. Possibly traveling on the continent, learning foreign languages. Possibly traveling in England as part of an acting troupe, okay? Possibly serving as a tutor / headmaster to students in a big country house, or possibly at a grammar school. Theory came out 5-10 years ago, maybe not even 5 years ago, that Shakespeare was a teacher on the southern coast at a small school for boys. Okay? And if I remember right, there's no real evidence that supported the theory, but the theory was, it came out in the Guardian and the independent newspapers in England and some other stuff. Another theory, let's see, headmaster, traveling actor, that he might have been a secretary to somebody of importance or power. Writing this person's correspondence, writing dedicatory or poems, to celebrate this person. But there's no evidence for any of them, all right? What we do know is that he's in London by the end of 1592 because he's referred to by another playwright and author. He's referred to derogatorily because he's more popular than this other playwright or author. The guy's name is Thomas Green. Okay? He wrote a play that, I'm trying to remember which play it is that Shakespeare does with it. He wrote a play that Shakespeare borrowed from and turned into one of his own plays, and his play was very popular. Not Thomas Green, Robert Green. Robert Greene's play was not popular. Okay? Man, I wish I could remember which play it was of Shakespeare's. It's not mentioned, I don't think. Might be Twelfth Night. And Robert Greene's is called Pandosto. Anyways, by 1594, I don't have it down here. I think it is by 1594. We know Shakespeare is a member of what is called the Lord Chamberlain's men. The Lord Chamberlain in Elizabethan England would be like equivalent to the vice president. I mean, next person in power to Queen Elizabeth. And the Lord Chamberlain patronized this group. He supported them, right? They're doing plays in London at a place called the Theatre that was built in 1575 by the father of one of the other actors in the Lord Chamberlain's men, right? When Queen Elizabeth dies and King James becomes king, the acting group is no longer called the Lord Chamberlain's men, they're now the King's men. James patronizes them himself. In 1599, the date here, the property that the theater was built upon, the lease comes due. The guy who built it didn't own the property, right? So, the Lord Chamberlain's men, whether they do it themselves or pay for construction workers to do it, they disassemble the theater. They take it apart. And they move about, last time I was in London, I actually walked this. I did a Shakespeare walk that I created for myself. Went to all the places in London that were associated with them. And it's probably walking-wise, 4? No, probably not 4. Somewhere between 3 and 5 miles. Okay, so they move it from an area of London. London's, got the River Thames going through it, and up in this area over here, you have what's called Shoreditch, and down here, south of the Thames, you have Southwark. They move from up here to down here, and they rebuild it, and they rename it. It's now called the Globe. The original Globe, or the foundations of it, were discovered about, 2022, they were building it in 95. Yeah, were discovered in about 1994 or so, under an apartment block. They were doing some kind of digging, and they found the original foundations for the Globe. If you go to London today and you go to the Globe Theatre, which it's called Shakespeare's Globe, you can see plays performed exactly as they sometimes, exactly as they would have been in Shakespeare's day. That theater is about a quarter of a mile west of the original Globe. Okay? They put it south of the River Thames because that means it's no longer bound by the laws of the City of London. Yes?
When did you say that Shakespeare joined the Lord Chamberlain's Men?
We know he was in there as of 1594. Okay? He might have been earlier. He might have been as early as 1592, but we know by 1594 he is. Okay? In the mid-1590s, plague had gone through London. And one of the things that happened as a result of that, it kind of like, with COVID, everything was shut down. All the playhouses were closed. Okay? So when the playhouses were reopened and when 1599 rolls around, what the Lord Chamberlain's men do is they move to the Globe or the theater, to where the mayor of London had no authority. So you had pop up around the same time several other playhouses. There's the Swan, there's the Globe, what's the other big one? I actually saw a production of, wasn't a good one, production of Hamlet in it. It's, again, underneath a building in like a cave, but it's the remains of, I can't remember the name of it. In 1612, the Globe burns down. They're doing a production of one of Shakespeare's plays. I think it's Henry VIII. It's either Henry VIII or one of the Henry VI. And in the production, they have a fire. They have to fire a cannon. And the blank, because there's no cannonball in it, but the wadding from the blank fires out, lands on top of the roof of the Globe, which is all thatch, and it burns to the ground. From that point on until 1994, there is no Globe Theater in London. 1994, I think it was, an American actor, filmmaker named Sam Wanamaker starts rebuilding the Globe. Beginning out of his own pocket. He's a millionaire. He's a famous actor and director and such. And it's one of the top tourist attractions in London today. Okay? Anything else there? One other thing. Notice, Shakespeare's only 52 when he dies. Assume for a moment that he starts writing plays 1590. We don't know when he begins writing plays. So from 64 to 1590, that's 26 years. So let's say he starts writing plays when he's 26 years old. He's only got 26 years left to live. We know he doesn't write anything after about 1612. So you go from 1590 to 1612, that's 22 years. All right? In that 22 years, he writes 37 full-length 5-act plays. What's that average out to? It's almost, it's not quite, about 1.5 a year. Okay? He writes 154 sonnets. We're going to read a couple of them when we get to poetry. Sonnets are 14-line poems. 154 times 14, you do the math. It's several thousand, it's a couple thousand lines of poetry. And then he writes 4 long poems. Shortest one is about 500 lines. The guy's just churning stuff out. And the thing is, none of it is crap. It's all better than pretty much anybody else could do at the time. Okay? Here's what's interesting about all that. He dies in 1660, and nobody says anything about his death until 1623. 1623, his partners in the theater, some of the Lord Chamberlain's men, some of the King's men, get together and they produce what's called the first folio. Folio refers to page size, book size, okay? And it's the first folio because there are others that come afterwards. This is the first collected edition of Shakespeare's plays. All right? Individual plays had been printed before. None of them, as far as we know, were ever printed with Shakespeare's approval or permission. This is before copyright laws. Copyright laws don't enter the picture until the 19th century. Okay? So we don't know that Shakespeare ever saw through publication any of his plays. Some of his poems, we are pretty sure he does. Those 4 long poems that I mentioned. The sonnets, we have no idea. Okay, whether or not Shakespeare intended those to be published or not. The reason, why I kind of find this interesting, you've got a 7-year period there, kind of like this 7-year period. It was pretty standard practice in this time period. If a famous playwright or poet died, somebody would, within a year of that person's death, put out a little publication celebrating that person. And it would be full of poems commending that person's ability, commending that person's, playwriting chops, so to speak. Nobody does that for 7 years. That is the biggest piece of evidence, all right, that supports what are called, let me remove this. The anti-Stratfordians. Do I have that written right? Stratfordian, yeah. Anti-Stratfordians are people who believe, argue, write books about, publish articles about, that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon was not the author of the plays attributed to William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon. Okay? This idea, I think the earliest suggestion of this idea is in the 19th century. In the earliest anti-Stratfordian says that the author of the plays was Francis Bacon, who was a knight, a lord, he was nobility, okay? Sir Francis Bacon, who wrote a lot of poetry, who wrote a lot of scientific stuff, Novum Organum and scientific treatises and such. He was an Earl of, I'm confusing him now with the Earl of Oxford. He wasn't the Earl of Oxford. So Francis Bacon was kind of the first name given to be the real author. And then there was a man named Edward de Vere, who was an Earl of Oxford, okay, who kind of became number 2 on the totem pole of possible real authors. And then a bunch of other people. Interestingly, the person who proposed Francis Bacon as the real author was related to Francis Bacon. The people who support de Vere are descendants of Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. They kind of have some skin in the game, in other words. Okay? Yes?
So they theorized that Shakespeare wasn't the author of any of his works, or just some of his works?
I want to be careful because I want to be accurate. Definitely not the author of the plays. The sonnets, possibly. Look, let me put it this way. What they imply is that there is no way the country bumpkin from Stratford-upon-Avon, who only had the equivalent of a 6th grade education, could have written the literary works that are attributed to William Shakespeare. Part of their argument is only somebody who attended a university could have written that material. What does that What kind of attitude does that betray on their parts? What word would we use to describe that mentality?
Classism.
Louder?
Classism.
Okay. Word that begins with E. Elitist. Only if you are at the very top kind of society. I don't mean top social status, top educationally. Only if you have received an Oxford or Cambridge education could you have written that material. Ben Jonson, I don't remember for reading any poems by Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson was a contemporary of Shakespeare's. He wrote, for this book, a long celebratory, commendatory poem. And in that, he makes the claim about Shakespeare having little Latin and less Greek, okay? Which the anti-Stratfordians latch onto and say, look, Ben Jonson said Shakespeare didn't know much Latin and he knew even less Greek. That argument is usually countered with, but Ben Jonson in that statement is comparing Shakespeare's knowledge of Latin and Greek with his own. Ben Jonson was the greatest classicist of his age. He ate, lived, breathed, drank Greek and Latin texts. Okay? He could dream in Greek and Latin. He was so thoroughly familiar with Greek and Latin, he could just, speak it off the bat.
So I'm not agreeing with that at all, but how did he write so much good work if he didn't have a lot of education?
Well, according to Johnson, Shakespeare had one inspiration. Okay, I'm not saying divine inspiration. It was just that he was born with this talent. Okay, and two, Johnson says, to be born with a talent is not enough. It took hard work. And he talks about how Shakespeare turned his lines. In the turning, it's a wood turning metaphor. That he had to sit there and calmly go over and revise and edit and such. Okay? A problem? We don't have any of Shakespeare's plays in his own handwriting. We don't have any of his poems in his own handwriting. We do have his handwriting in, I said he stopped writing plays somewhere in 1612. We do know he helped a couple of other playwrights because we have manuscripts of a couple of plays that have Shakespeare's handwriting where he's crossed out lines and inserted lines. In other words, he's like, here, let me take a look. And no, this isn't good. And he writes other passages in that then become part of the published version of those plays. We do have that, okay? We have six signatures of Shakespeare on legal documents. He was involved in a few lawsuits because he was a businessman, okay? These guys owned stock in their company. So they were very, aware of having to do well at the box office. Almost all the plays were, 90% sure, that were produced by the Lord Chamberlain's men and then the King's men. Almost all of those were plays by Shakespeare. In other words, he's writing plays for his own group to perform. We do know because there are manuscripts of some of these plays that are not written in Shakespeare's hand. And there are copies of the plays that have been printed. We do know other people hijacked, stole, plagiarized some of Shakespeare's works. And because of the form that they take, we're pretty sure that probably actors from other acting companies would go to the Globe, watch a play, and either take notes or memorize it. Because, this is back when actors could memorize entire plays. and then leave and go and write it all down quickly. But they screwed it up. We have copies of those, what are called foul papers, all right? So, talent, inborn talent, I would say people like J.K. Rowling has that. How the hell did she come up with the Harry Potter idea? I mean, at one moment, she is just an unwed mother. She had been married, unwed mother, living on welfare, doesn't have 2 pennies to rub to her name. And 5 seconds later, she has an idea about a boy who discovers on his 11th birthday the greatest dark wizard who ever lived, killed his parents and wants to kill him. And within 15 years, she's the richest woman in Great Britain. Wealthier than the Queen in 2007, when her 7th book came out. I mean, just let that sit for a while. Okay? There's got to be gift there, as there is for most really, really, I would say, great writers. John Milton, we're not going to read anything of Milton. Milton wrote this big, long poem called Paradise Lost. I mean, the poem itself is this long. It's divided into multiple books, 12 of them, right? He composed it all up here and dictated it to his daughter because he was blind by the time he came to creating this, okay? I mean, that is one of the questions, the anti-Stratfordians ask. But there's references to Shakespeare by his contemporaries. There's a guy who kept a diary of all the places he went to. If you ever saw the film Shakespeare in Love, go watch it. It's not bad. Geoffrey Rush plays Philip Henslowe, I believe. Henslowe was an actor and manager, I believe, of a rival acting company, okay? And he kept a very detailed diary of all the plays he went and saw in London. Because he's doing what? He's like an athletic scout, or he's like a team spy. He's watching how the other team performs. He's watching how the other actors, what they're doing, etc. And could be, one of those copying the plays and such. Okay. Okay, we'll stop there with Shakespeare. Look briefly. You've got the discussions of Shakespeare's theater, 1173 and following. Okay. That's right, I can't hear you, so that. There are 3 great periods of drama. One, the classical period, ancient Greece and Rome. 2, the Elizabethan period, roughly you could say 1550 to about 1642. And 3rd, the modern period. Really, this is kind of the late 19th century to today. Okay, so ancient Greece and Rome, we read Sophocles' Oedipus the King, which Aristotle held up as the greatest. Okay, but that goes to the 1st century AD of Rome. So roughly 450 BC to 100 AD, if you want. Okay. The Elizabethan period, roughly 1550 to about 1642. I think it's 1642 when Parliament closes all the playhouses. Why? Because they were anti-plays. Because a lot of the plays were anti-Parliament. Cancel culture is not new. I mean, you don't like what somebody says, cut their tongue out, which Queen Elizabeth did. The first, not the second. Yes?
Oh, what does number 1 say?
Classical period, ancient Greece and Rome. Okay. then the Elizabethan period, and then the modern period. The modern period, some people may say, well, it's not really the late 19th century, that maybe we should go back to the mid 18th century, so like 1750, because we do have playwrights writing in, and it's starting to kind of make a comeback. I think it's really more late 19th century where we start to see the rise of the great playwrights again. George Bernard Shaw, can't remember his first name. Henrik Ibsen writes Doll's House up to today. Yeah, I don't know that I would say actually up to today. I would say probably more like up through the 1960s. And then playwriting's not, we've gone back to more of the musical kind of stuff since then, okay? So, the rest of your thing talks about, so what happens after, let's say this? Well, in 410 AD, you got the fall of Rome. And the fall of Rome kicks off what scholars of the Renaissance, that is, scholars in the Renaissance, that's 1400s, 1500s, right, called the Dark Ages. From 400 to about when they lived. Why was it the Dark Ages? Because it was assumed that there was a total loss of classical learning, Greek and Roman. Total loss of the ability to read the classical text, and a total loss of, enlightenment, so to speak. It wasn't that everybody was an idiot, and it wasn't that there wasn't anything of cultural value produced. I could pull up a whole bunch of pictures on the internet and show you things that were produced during what's called the height of the Dark Ages, 600, 700, 800 AD, that we can't reproduce. Like manuscript illumination. Can't come close to it. Gold jewelry. The ability to make it is gone, in other words, okay? But beginning around 1000 AD, we don't have an exact date, but around 1000 or so, maybe a little later, maybe 1100, 1200, drama kind of is reborn. And if you go back to the ancient classical period, drama's origins are in religious festivals. Okay? The very first dramatist, whose name is escaping me, shouldn't happen. The first drama had one actor, so it was a monologue. Okay? The second dramatist introduced two actors. Sophocles comes around, we have three actors on stage. Okay? So the first one you have one actor on stage, second one you have two actors, third one you have three actors on stage. And after Sophocles, Katie barred the door, you can have as many actors on the stage as you want. In what are called the Middle Ages, 1000, 1200 AD, in the church, in the Catholic Church in England, drama arises again. And it arises during the Easter season. There's a passage in Scripture when the women disciples run to the tomb after the crucifixion, the Sunday morning afterwards. Why are they running to the tomb? Are they expecting Jesus to be resurrected? No, they're not. They're going there because they weren't able to anoint the body for proper burial before he was buried. Because Sabbath, man, sun sets Friday afternoon, you stop all work. So take the body down, just put it in the cave, kind of a thing. So they go to anoint the body. They get there, and what do they see? There's a handsome young youth. The doors rolled open. They look, nothing there. And they ask, where is our Lord? He said, and the youth/angel says, he is not here. He's gone before you to Galilee, tell his disciples. So, that little scene starts getting acted out in the church. So somebody stands up and pretends to be like Mary Magdalene. Where have they laid my Lord? And somebody else stands up and says, he is not here. It's called the Quim, it's Latin, Quim quaeritus trope. Where is he? Kind of a thing. Okay? That then starts getting bigger and bigger. And then it moves outside of the church to church holidays. The Corpus Christi Day celebration, as an example, Body of Christ Day celebration in early summer, okay? And other such things. So now people start writing plays to fill these things. And that's what these are referring to on pages 1174. Page 1174. Okay? Mystery plays dramatize stories from the Bible, such as creation, fall of Adam and Eve, or the crucifixion. Notice, it's not in bold print, it's in italics. I want you to know these, though. Okay? So mystery plays are dramatizations of stories from the Bible. Okay? And you've got the most famous one, Second Shepherd's Play. Okay? Miracle plays are based on the lives of saints. Why? Because saints perform miracles. An excellent play of that, example, is St. Mary Magdalene. There's one about Abraham and Isaac, which can also be a mystery play because it's a biblical story, but that one's also a miracle story at the same time. And then you have morality plays that present allegorical stories in which virtues and vices are personified to teach humanity how to achieve salvation. Every Man, the play that's referred there, is the greatest example of that. Because every man doesn't have names like Ted or James or John or Mary or, Lisa or Sally. It's got names of characters like vice, goodness, good deeds, friends, loyalty, friendship. Okay? And it's all about getting this didactic message across. That's what morality plays. They're about morality. Okay? These aren't produced very often today. None of these three. Because they're not that interesting. I mean, they're beating you over the head with some kind of biblical moral or some kind of virtue or something like that. Most people today want more entertainment and not, less teaching, so to speak. Ancient Roman poet, name of Horace, said the purpose of literature is twofold. To teach and delight. It's not one or the other. Okay? If all you're trying to do is this, the teaching part, and not this, you're going to lose your audience. If you're only doing this and none of this, you're also going to lose your audience. Because your audience isn't going to want to come back for more, essentially, he's suggesting. Okay? So if you've got other comments, I'm not going to talk a lot more about the introduction. Go over the boldface terms. You've got a diagram of Shakespeare's globe. Page 1177 talks about comedy, romantic comedies, comic relief, okay, satire, know all those terms. Tragedy, notice, in contrast, does not promise peace and contentment. Comedy doesn't mean, ha, 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 this is funny. Comedy means society can be ruptured, torn apart, but at the end of the play, it's restored. The division is fixed. There is no longer a rupture. Our society is not a comedy. Our society right now is divided, right? We're in the midst of a tragedy, so to speak, if we were talking in terms of literary terms, right? In a tragedy, that disruption happens and it stays disrupted. But usually the individual causing the disruption dies. The tragic hero. One other thing. You've got a note on reading Shakespeare. Okay? Several notes, actually. Points 1 through 6 on page 1180. If you can, for both Midsummer Night's Dream and Hamlet, watch a version of the play. There's a ton of them out there. Some are really good, some are really bad. Hamlet. I don't know if it's on YouTube or not. There's a Richard Burton version from 1964. It's actually not the final version that was done on Broadway. It's a rehearsal version. But it's kind of full character and stuff. I think it's the greatest version of Hamlet there is. There are others. Tom Hiddleston did a version. Pretty sure it's on YouTube. Might even be on Hulu or something like that. Mel Gibson did the god-awful one with Glenn Close and several other people. It's really bad because it takes way too many liberties. Kenneth Branagh did a very long version, and that's because he doesn't cut anything. Hamlet's about the longest. It takes about 4 hours to produce if you don't skip anything. Okay? He takes some liberties, does some things that I don't think are in the play. Midsummer Night's Dream, there's a pretty good version with Kevin Kline and Michelle Pfeiffer and Stanley Tucci, a very young Stanley Tucci, who, if I remember right, plays Puck, the mischievous sprite.
Is that the one where she swings the donkey?
Yes.
Oh.
Not literally a donkey, somebody whose head has been transformed into that of an ass. There's a few other versions that I can't remember off the top of my head. The one with Kevin Kline and Michelle Pfeiffer and Stanley Tucci, it's pretty good. So we'll start Midsummer Night's Dream on Monday. Just Act 1. Act 1 is about 10 pages. We should probably be able to get through that. Remember, if you haven't already taken it, the Oedipus quiz is due tonight, I believe, 11:59. Don't forget to do that. I am going to send you, before I cut this off, I am going to send you a PDF version of your completed fiction exam that shows you how it's been graded and everything. I've got to go through each one, save it as a PDF file, and send it off to you. But since you can't see it, I want to do that.